a listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here for The Briefing. Who should decide what's acceptable to wear to the office? Office fashion is forever changing and evolving, but in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge shift in office workwear, with experts saying it's partly because of the pandemic and working from home, and also because of younger generations entering the workplace. So what does this all mean for productivity, gender norms, and HR? We asked some people who work in a corporate office setting on if it's changed and who gets to decide your wardrobe.
Do you think office fashion has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I've always worn just a T-shirt and shorts for the 12 years that I've worked here for, but everyone dresses the same. I feel like it's become more homogenized, even though I feel like these days it should be broader than it ever has been.
I would just say more creative styles, people sort of more unique personality coming through their clothes, and the ability to do that and not just have to sort of wear like a structured thing, and lots of like layering as well, I would say.
I think it's changed for the more entry-level and middle-level positions, but I think at the higher end, it's still mostly the same as it has been in the past. I feel like because I'm in a management position, I can only dress so casual, and if I want to get to the next level up, I feel like you still have to dress for the job you want, and that you still have to be quite corporate when you get into a senior management position.
And who do you think should tell us what to wear to work?
No one. Yourself. I do not agree with office dress codes.
I think there still should be like a level of professionalism within industries to an extent, but I think we should be able to sort of express ourselves and wear what we want.
I think I should decide what I wear to work, unless you've got a uniform, unless you're in an industry that requires uniform for safety reasons. I think you could kind of be able to wear whatever you want.
It should be a collaborative effort between management and staff, because at the end of the day, everyone has to work in a cohesive, functional environment, and it should still reflect the values of the company.
We then spoke with Lauren Sams, the fashion editor at the Australian Financial Review, and employment lawyer Roxanne Hart, to find out who makes the rules around what's corporate chic and what's going to send you straight to HR. Roxanne explained who can tell you what to wear and what happens when you break the rules.
So there's no black and white answer to this. Unfortunately, it depends on each specific circumstances as to whether or not they can tell you what to wear. So the basis of an employer's right to tell you what to wear comes down to their ability to give employees lawful and reasonable directions in connection with their employment. So an employer could enforce a uniform policy or a dress code in their workplace on the basis that that is a lawful and reasonable direction. So when thinking about whether or not it's lawful, you would be considering anti-discrimination laws, for example. So are you targeting a specific group of people based on their gender, for example, when enforcing a dress code, or is it something that's enforced across the board? So an example of that is I believe the airlines have now revised all of their dress codes to not necessarily have different standards for women and men. So I believe previously Qantas, for example, had a dress code which required women to wear heels, but that would potentially be seen as discriminatory these days because you're just targeting women and requiring them to wear that. So now I believe that they say people can wear heels or not heels regardless of their gender if they wish to do so. So that's one example of something that comes down to whether or not a direction is lawful. So it all relates back to anti-discrimination legislation particularly, and whether or not it's reasonable as well.
Can your employer punish you for dressing, and I'm doing air quotes here, inappropriately?
Yes, they definitely can. So if you wear something that's inappropriate to the workplace, then it could be within the employer's right to give you a warning. And then if you continue to dress inappropriately, then they could issue further warnings and eventually terminate you for that inappropriate dress. It would all come down to whether or not the employer has a policy or has issued you directions in the first place in relation to your dress. So, for example, if something has always been fine and then they suddenly start issuing you warnings, that probably wouldn't be reasonable. They should give you some notice first if they are changing the dress code or implementing something different. But there has certainly been many cases where employers have terminated employees and effectively, I guess, punished them by way of termination because of their dress. So, for example, there was a guy who worked at Woolies. He was working in the deli section and he wore an eyebrow ring to work, and Woolies said that was not in accordance with their dress code, and he offered to cover it up with a Band-Aid, I believe, but that still wasn't meeting Woolworths requirements, and their WHS standards, etc., required staff not to have any facial piercings on show that weren't covered by the hairnet, and obviously an eyebrow ring wouldn't be covered by the hairnet. So in that case, the employee was issued with several warnings and then terminated, and that employee made an unfair dismissal claim, and I believe they were unsuccessful in that claim because it was a lawful and reasonable direction that Woolworths issued to them to say, take off the eyebrow ring. But there's been a ton of different cases where sometimes employees are successful and sometimes they're unsuccessful.
You mentioned company policies and anti-discrimination laws just before. I'm curious to know, can your employer contract override the protections you're afforded under anti-discrimination laws?
There could be a situation where that would be permitted if it was a workplace health and safety risk. So, for example, I could think maybe there might be certain cases where people of certain religions are required or have a preference to wear certain attire that's consistent with their religion or their culture, but then that attire may not be appropriate for a certain location. Like, for example, if they work on a mining site, trying to think of like for example, the Sikh religion that some people are obviously part of, they wear like metal bangles quite often and turbans and whatnot. And there could be a situation where if you're working on a mining site and you had a turban on, you couldn't necessarily wear like the requisite hard hat or something like that. So then it's a problem for the employer from a workplace health and safety perspective, because they have a requirement and a duty of care to their employees to provide a safe working environment and to make sure that their employees are safe at work. But if the employee can't comply with the dress code that relates back to health and safety requirements, like the hard hat requirement, or if, for example, somebody's wearing a bangle, then that could get caught in machinery, etc. So it could be reasonable for an employer in that case to issue a direction that says you can't wear those specific items of attire, even though they do relate to your religion.
Sticking with the complexities of discrimination, does that mean there can be different rules for men and women?
It would be difficult to think of many cases where that would be appropriate. So we'd have to probably wait and see whether there'll be some cases on that in the coming years and what the courts consider circumstances where that might be reasonable. I can't off the top of my head think of any particular circumstances where it would be reasonable at this point in time.
If someone does feel like they've been unfairly discriminated against because of what they've been wearing, what advice would you give them? What do you do?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because you can understand both sides of the argument. Like there'll be circumstances where employers need employees to dress in a certain way in order to protect the employer's image and to also just be consistent across the board. But then there's also, that doesn't necessarily leave room for employees to express themselves, et cetera, and bring their whole selves to work as they may wish to do. So if I was an employee in that situation where we had an issue in relation to what I was wearing to work, then I would, at the first instance, try and come up with some sort of compromise with my manager or my boss. So, for example, there was a Virgin Australia case, and this was a while ago when Virgin had a haircut policy in place that men couldn't have hair that was longer than 4 centimetres. And there was a man who worked for them, and he had hair that was much longer than that, and he was refusing to cut it. But he said to his manager, look, I'm happy to wear a wig that would then give the appearance of having hair that was like 4 centimetres. So, he tried to come up with a compromise, and ultimately that was rejected by Virgin and they terminated him, and he was successful in his unfair dismissal claim in that case. But it was relevant that he had offered to wear a wig and to come up with, a bit of a compromise in that circumstance. So if I was an employee, I would try and compromise with my employer in relation to the dress code to try and fit in with whatever it is that I'm wanting to wear.
Having a rule like 4 centimetres hair for a man and the one that we mentioned before with Qantas with the heels and how some of those rules are changing.
Yes.
How important is it that these rules are changing? Because some of them do seem really silly, but then some of them could be for safety reasons. But why do we have some of these rules that just kind of seem ridiculous sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and I guess times are changing now. Like, back in the day, it was a lot more expected, for example, in airlines and with air hostesses that they looked a certain way, had makeup that looked a certain way, hair and heels, etc. And nowadays, it's more commonplace that people are able to, wear different things and express themselves in different ways, and individuality, I guess, is coming into it a bit more, and companies are more conscious nowadays, or they should be more conscious about not discriminating between genders when specifying dress codes. So I can understand an employer's perspective, though, in wanting staff to look a certain way. And I also think if you become an employee of an organisation, and when you become an employee, you're aware from the outset that this is what staff from this organisation look like, this is what the organisation wants staff to be dressing like and to present themselves on behalf of the organisation in a certain way, well, you're kind of signing up and agreeing to that. I don't necessarily think it's fair then for an employee down the track to try and change that and go against the grain unless they have a good reason for doing so, when from the outset they were aware of what appearances were like in an organisation. But it's, obviously completely different if a company changes the rules partway through someone's employment, then I think they have much more grounds for pushing back on a dress code that's implemented at that point in time. So, you can see both sides of the argument, I guess. But at the end of the day, an employee is being paid by an employer to do a job and to represent that organisation. And it could be reasonable, provided the employer's directions are reasonable and lawful, it could be reasonable for them to request that they dress a certain way.
Lauren Sams is a fashion editor, and she explained how what you wear can impact your productivity and why the standards for male and female employees are different. Lauren, who decides what's acceptable workwear and what isn't?
Well, I think your boss usually decides what's acceptable workwear and what isn't, which is to say, it is very much a case-by-case situation, I find.
Yeah, there are a lot of different, vibes depending what market you work in, what your job is. Some places have uniforms or codes you have to stand by or company policy. We've seen this kind of shift recently a lot with Gen Z entering the workforce with a more casual wardrobe. Do you think Gen Z is the only reason we've seen this?
Look, I think coming out of COVID, a lot of things have been relaxed, and the workplace is one of those things because we did have hybrid work for a long time. We had working from home. People got very used to not dressing for the office or coming to the office in a more relaxed way. If they had reduced hours in the office or if there were not so many people in the office, I don't think you were expected really to do the whole suit and tie thing if there were only going to be, a handful of you in the office that day. And so for various reasons, we did get used to, wearing sneakers instead of heels or jeans instead of a suit and tie. But additionally, I think you hit on a good point there where young people who are coming into the workforce after COVID, these are their first jobs. And I think perhaps they're not really sure of what to wear, of what the dress code is or what appropriate standards are. And so I think you've got these two things sort of melding and happening at the same time.
Why are there still different standards for what's acceptable when it comes to men and women's fashion in the workplace?
I don't know if there are different standards. I think that there's a lot more of a range of what women can wear. So, when it comes to men's workwear, I think if a man was going to wear short shorts to the office, for example, I think he probably would be told that's not a professional look and tomorrow could you please cover the legs? But I think that wouldn't really happen because it's just not part of a man's wardrobe. Whereas, you open my wardrobe and perhaps your wardrobe, Helen, and you would find a whole range of things, dresses, some of them short, some of them long, some of them knee length. You would find all sorts of pants, some of them tighter than others, looser than others. We have like a huge range of clothes from which to choose, which means that, when you approach the workplace, there's also that selection that's happening there. And so I do understand what you're saying that, I think perhaps there is some sexism at play, but I think also we just have a lot more to choose from. And let's not forget, women in the workplace is still, this sounds kind of crazy, but it is still a relatively recent phenomenon. The idea of women working full-time outside of the home is really only something that has happened in the last 30, 40 years. So it's not a convention that has been established for very long. And so I think there's still things to be ironed out there, definitely. It's why you see so many female politicians sticking to a uniform of sorts. Kamala Harris in her pantsuits is a really good example. She wears different colours, different styles, but essentially she is pretty much wearing the same thing every day. And I think it's for that reason. It kind of, it's like a man, right? She limits her options and she knows what is going to work and feel comfortable and look good.
Does what you wear affect your productivity?
I think so, yeah. Didn't you find during COVID that I certainly found that the days where, and this is interesting actually, the days where I wore active wear, I was more active. because I think some people might say that if you're wearing something that's sort of more professional, you might feel more productive because you feel like you're at work. But when I was at home, and I had my activewear on, I felt like I could spring into action at any time. But I certainly feel like, I think it's very well established that what you wear affects how you feel and your mood. And I certainly think that your productivity plays a part in that. I know that when I put a little bit of effort into what I wear, I feel so much better. And yeah, I think that definitely affects your output and your energy and what you set out to accomplish that day. And certainly, when I'm speaking to other people, if I'm, if I have to go to a conference or if I'm interviewing somebody, I want to present a really nice version of myself and also know that I'm representing my workplace and all of those sorts of things. And I think it is really important.
That was Lauren Sams, the fashion editor at the Australian Financial Review, and employment lawyer Roxanne Hart. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone else you think might enjoy it too. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.